Very important topic to consider. How is the National Forest Service dealing with the very difficult issues that are going to present us now and in the future with climate change? So I'll turn it over to Kristin.
Thank you. It was a little crackly when Tom was speaking. Is it clear? Is it okay? Can you hear me? Keep it down here. Okay. Got a thumbs up. Great. So again, my name is Kristin McBride. I'm the Natural Resources Staff Officer for the Deschutes and Ochoco National Forest and for the Crooked River National Grassland. I'd like to start out by thanking the organizers of the 350 Deschutes Conference for this opportunity and for the invitation to be here today. While this conference is generally a little bit more focused on sustainable operations and actions we can take in our businesses and our homes and in the design of our cities and communities, I think it's really important to incorporate the national forest. The forest is integral to our outdoor lifestyles in Central Oregon, and it also obviously contributes significantly to the livability of our communities. I would also add that I think that the forest is the backdrop for our social and economic landscape, including everything from the recreation and tourism industry to the forest products and wood products industry as well. My personal belief system is that we're still learning about climate change and what it means for our futures. And I think forging new and stronger partnerships and extended networks to bring all the brain power that we can to this topic is really, really critical. And I think this conference is a step in that direction. So I'm glad to be here today. And I'm also excited to share with you some larger agency vision from the Forest Service and USDA perspective, as well as just share with you what we're doing here locally in Central Oregon around climate change. Next slide, please. So starting with national direction, in 2010, the USDA Forest Service developed the Climate Change Performance Scorecard. And this performance scorecard contains 10 elements within 4 separate categories. Starting at the top with organizational capacity, fundamentally getting at things like employee education and awareness around the topic of climate change. It ensures and directs us to all have designated climate change coordinators on each one of the units in the National Forest System nationwide. This also incorporates climate change program guidance and integrating climate change guidance into program direction for the management of other natural resources. Under the topic of engagement, we have science and management partnerships, which obviously is key. The body of literature around climate change is evolving and changing all the time. We're learning new information. And so being very strongly connected to the scientific community is important. Other partnerships is listed there, and what I would point to for that, especially for the Deschutes National Forest and also for the Ochoco National Forest, is that we rely heavily on our collaborators and the work that we do with our collaborators to manage our forested ecosystems and our aquatic ecosystems. So a couple of examples I would point to for that is we've been working now with the Deschutes Collaborative Forest Project on an over 200,000 acre landscape on the Deschutes National Forest for 7 years. The venture's intended to go for 10 and potentially beyond. And we really rely on the DCFP to help us create more resilient landscapes. We also do a lot of work with partners in collaboration with partners on aquatic ecosystem, stream channel restoration, and riparian area management. So folks like the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and the Deschutes River Conservancy are key to those efforts. Under adaptation, that includes assessing vulnerability, which is what I'm going to speak to primarily today, as well as adaptation action development and monitoring. Monitoring can be in the context of the vulnerability assessment and how we're changing over time, but it also can include the ongoing monitoring that we've done at the site-specific local scale, things like stream temperature monitoring. And then lastly, the last category is mitigation and sustainable consumption, which includes a carbon assessment and carbon stewardship. All of the forests in the National Forest System now have baseline carbon assessments that have been completed, and it also includes sustainable operations. So I want to share quickly that each forest every year is expected to respond to metrics and questions related to each one of the 10 elements housed here. Our forest supervisors submit these scorecard responses up to our regional office, and in the Pacific Northwest, that is located in Portland. They take a look at it from a regional perspective and track our progress over time as an individual forest or forest. And then they also send that information up to the Washington office to determine how we're doing overall as an agency in response to climate change effects. Okay, next slide. So my objectives for today's presentation, now that you have sort of a sense of what we're doing in USDA and the Forest Service, is to provide you with a brief introduction and overview of our efforts around sustainable operations to reduce our environmental footprint in the facilities that we have in all the communities that we serve. We have a lot of facilities, so this is an important piece. But I'm going to spend the bulk of the time talking about our climate change vulnerability assessment, primarily the process, some preliminary results of that process, and then also speak to a little bit of adaptation examples from other forests in the Pacific Northwest region that are a little bit further down this path than we are. Next slide. So with the goal of reducing our environmental footprint, Element 10 of the Climate Change Performance Scorecards contains some pretty rigorous monitoring metrics of things like energy consumption, energy conservation, the use of renewable energy in our facilities, looks at water consumption, water conservation efforts, fleet and transportation, specifically focusing on things like fuel consumption of our fleet, the incorporation of electric vehicles at as many units as we possibly can have those, as well as providing alternative transportation for our employees and our publics, things as basic as van pools for all the employees that live in LaPine that commute to Crescent, or that live in Redmond and commute to Prineville, that sort of thing. We're also required to follow pretty strict guidelines around green purchasing and purchasing of green sourced materials. Sustainable leadership in this element speaks to the leadership that's provided for things not only that I'm speaking to around sustainable operations in our day-to-day functions in the workplace, but also the incorporation of climate science and climate change effects in the management of our natural resources out on the landscape. I do want to mention our green teams might seem like a minor component, but I think that they're really key to sustainable leadership. They do a great job supplementing employee education, offering things like brown bag lunches to employees and inviting guest speakers from the Environmental Center come over. I'm getting a head shake right here because I see one of those faces today talking about the Bend Energy Challenge. I think she was at our office twice. The green team also helps implementing smaller green practices to help change employee behaviors not only in the workplace but in their home environment around things like composting or the use of native plants in landscaping or energy reduction. And they've also been really successful over the past couple of years obtaining microgrants from our regional office to do things like purchase rechargeable batteries for all the GPS units and cameras that we use in the work that we do in the forest, or purchasing of rain catchment systems, that kind of stuff. Lastly, in this arena, I would add that we've built in the last several years 2 really large new offices in Central Oregon. The most recent is the Crescent Ranger District that was built in the last 2 years, not even. And it's LEED certified, as well as the Bend Pine admin site, which houses the Deschutes National Forest headquarters, as well as the Bend Fort Rock office, is also a LEED certified building. So it incorporates all of these elements and many, many more. Next slide. So shifting into the climate change vulnerability assessment, I mentioned the climate change performance scorecard as the original framework and direction supporting a climate change vulnerability assessment. But this is also incorporated into our 2012 planning rule for the revision of our land and resource management plans. And so the planning rule requires that we have an evaluation of climate change in the assessment phase, that period where we're looking at need for change when we develop a plan, and then also consideration of climate change effects in the development of the plan components themselves. So in addition to satisfying the climate change performance scorecard on an annual basis and meeting the 2012 planning rule, more fundamentally, and in my view, the vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy will provide a common foundation for employee education, community education, engagement, and collaboration ongoing. and then also provide critical information for developing other landscape restoration action plans. Prioritizing on the landscape, which is so key. We all have limited capacity and financial resources to do the work that we do, and I imagine that we will overlay our vulnerability assessment with other frameworks, such as the watershed condition framework, to decide where we want to put those limited resources to complete work on the landscape. I'll also add, just for folks' awareness, we've been threatening this for a couple of years, that we'll be launching into the revision of our land and resource management plan. As of late, I'm told that we're probably looking at launching into that effort in fiscal year 18, which kicks off about a year from now. So that we're working from the same place in terms of the definitions and the way that we're thinking about vulnerability and adaptation. In this context, vulnerability is considered an evaluation of the degree to which systems are susceptible to adverse impacts of climate change. A vulnerability assessment can be both quantitative and qualitative, and it can address whole systems and individual species, and both. Adaptation is defined as an adjustment in natural or human systems to mitigate or moderate harm or exploit the benefits of climate change, depending on the way that you look at it. So our vulnerability assessment is housed within what we call the South Central Oregon Adaptation Partnership. It's one of many adaptation partnerships that are happening west-wide. And because we are the feds, we love acronyms. And our acronym for this is SCOPE. Like soap, but SCOPE. So SCOPE is a Forest Service science management collaboration representing the Deschutes and Ochoco National Forest, the Crooked River National Grassland. It also includes the Fremont-Wainema National Forest and Crater Lake National Park. The goals of SCOPE are to increase climate change awareness in this region, to assess vulnerability of our cultural and natural resources, and also obviously to develop science-based adaptation strategies and incorporate them into management of federal lands in South Central Oregon. So I'm going to briefly show you the website associated with our adaptation partnership. So you can see that the website includes information, shows the geographic extent. On the right-hand side, under what's new, which isn't so new anymore, are the SCOPE vulnerability assessment summaries, which is a little bit further back in time, but it gives you a sense of some of the information I'll present today. If you scroll back up just a little bit and click on objectives and target outcomes, if you look at the schematic, it really shows how SCOPE products will be used in all levels of management, operations, and planning. So I think this is a really sort of convenient look at how we plan to incorporate the information. And I'd just like to remind our publics and our forest leadership team and our technical specialists that this document really is going to be a synthesis of best available science as we know it now. And we're lucky to have that because it's, as I said, evolving and emerging all the time. And so we'll be lucky to have this foundational document to springboard from into the future. One other link on here, if you could just click quickly on partners. Key to this effort obviously includes all of the national forests that I mentioned. The Pacific Northwest Research Station is a part of this as well. National Park Service, Crater Lake, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, Northwest Climate Science Center, the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, and Oregon State University Climate Impacts Research Consortium. It's very difficult to say those very quickly. So those are our partners. Okay. So going back to PowerPoint, it's fairly daunting. Next slide, please. To launch into a climate change vulnerability assessment. And I feel very fortunate that the leads that we have for this effort are as experienced and recognized in their field as they are. The co-leads are Dave Peterson. He's a senior research biologist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station, and he's also the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for his contribution to an intergovernmental panel on climate change. And it also includes Jessica Holofsky. She's a research ecologist with the University of Washington School of Environment and Forest Sciences. Also helping to lead this effort, because several forests in Region 6 are going through this at the same time, is Becky Gravenmeyer. She's our climate change coordinator for the Pacific Northwest. The leadership team also includes myself and Mike Ruteau. He's the forest hydrologist and climate change coordinator for the Fremont-Wainema National Forest. So just to give you a sense of what this process entailed, we had a kickoff meeting back in January of 2015. And at this kickoff meeting, the goal with facilitation by Dave and Jessica was to identify the key resource areas and questions and the knowledge gaps that we wanted to address in our vulnerability assessment. Because even though there's a lot of similarities in these assessments across the West, they're also really meant to be tailored for the landscape that you're looking at. We also used this time to identify the team leaders and sort of the primary authors of the individual chapters in this assessment, and also identify the key specialists from the National Forest that were participating that would help to drive the interpretation of the data, the research, the model outputs, all of that information. For us, just so you have a sense of who was in the room, from an internal perspective, we had program managers from recreation, engineering and roads, our heritage program manager, and all of my folks in natural resources at the forest level, everyone from the civiculturist to the botanist to the invasive plant program coordinator to the forest ecologist, fisheries hydrology, and the list goes on. Next slide. So these are the key resources that we chose to address in the assessment. We've included fisheries, both habitat and key species are addressed. Water uses, specifically the availability and timing. We include infrastructure because of the impacts of future larger scale events, like flooding events in the winter months, and how that will impact infrastructure and facilities. Recreation, because it's so integral to our lifestyle as residents of Central Oregon and to our tourism industry, we decided we would cover the gamut of recreation. Warm and cold weather recreation, wildlife recreation, everything from birding to hunting and fishing. We have water-based recreation, obviously recreation that goes on our lakes and rivers and streams. And then we have forest products, from gathering firewood to collecting mushrooms to cutting Christmas trees. For wildlife, because there would be an unwieldy list of wildlife species included in this very sizable landscape, we opted to focus on key habitat types and successional stages in vegetation communities as a surrogate for wildlife species. And we also manage the habitat, so that was the right thing to do. From the vegetation perspective, runs the gamut, starting all the way up at the top with subalpine forest to dry pine forest, down to shrublands, woodlands, and all the way down to our lower elevation grasslands. And then I think to this point in time, we might be the only vulnerability assessment in the West that includes a chapter on ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, we also have direction for that in the 2012 planning rule. And we wanted to incorporate resources and management issues that are not explicitly covered anywhere else in this assessment. So things like pollination, carbon, forest products, invasive species effect on our native species and populations, cultural and heritage values, things like first foods for our tribal partners in Central Oregon, that's all housed in ecosystem services. Next slide. So that 14 months of working on vulnerability assessments led up to and culminated in a vulnerability and adaptation workshop, March of this calendar year. We did a kickoff presentation for the public on what this entailed, similar to the information I'm sharing with you here today, over at Central Oregon Community College, and that was Dave Peterson and Jessica Holofsky leading that presentation. We also had some input from our forest supervisor, John Allen. The first day of presentations essentially was a full day of what the draft vulnerability assessments for each one of those key resources uncovered. And the second day was really more breakout groups and brainstorming sessions about adaptation actions and strategies that we could develop and put into play to respond to climate change effects. This was a well-attended workshop. We had everyone from existing partners like the Nature Conservancy, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We had ODF, Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council. We had several county representatives. The Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs had representatives there. We had several of our environmental collaborators, OSU Extension, Mount Bachelor, and a much longer list than that, just to name a few. Next slide. Okay. So, my caveat on this slide is this. I am by no means an expert in climate change modeling or climate science, but I'm going to share with you the place that we started from, which really drove some of the vulnerabilities that were identified for the other key resources that I've already talked about. So to the best of my ability, here I go. Complex general circulation models, or GCMs, are used to project future climate. For the scope area, our researchers used the NASA Earth Exchange downscaled climate projections data set, which includes 31 general circulation models and we use that for 2 scenarios in 2 distinct periods of time. So under the first scenario, the assumption is that we will have a significant reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions and a stabilizing climate by the year 2100. The second scenario assumes increasing greenhouse gases to the end of the 21st century. And within those 2 scenarios, we looked at 2 separate time periods. Mid-century, which is represented between 2035 and 2064, and 2070 to 2099 represents the late century time frame. All 31 GCMs aligned on the fact that there will be an increase in temperature under both scenarios, ranging from 2 to 2.6 degrees Celsius. And then in the late century scenario, somewhere between 2.7 and 4.7 degrees Celsius. The predictions for precipitation are much more variable and less clear, but there was some alignment in the fact that there might be a little bit more precipitation departed from the historical time period. Now, obviously, the amount, timing, and type of precipitation will change, affecting stream flow, stream temperatures, and obviously snowpack. So next slide. This comes right from Mr. Peterson's, Dr. Peterson's PowerPoint. So what will future climate feel like? The average temperature, average of high and low, in July currently for us feels like 82. In the future it could feel as high as 92 degrees Fahrenheit. And in January it currently feels like 41 degrees. In the future it could feel more like 51 degrees. So a quick look inside the assessment. And this is one of those, as we go into the next series of slides, each bullet has a step down, just so you know. All right, next slide. So climate change effects on water, and I'm going to provide very high level feedback to you here. We do expect a reduced amount and duration of snowpack and more rain on snow events. Reduced water supply in summer when the demand is highest for things like agriculture, municipalities, and recreation. We expect higher peak flows and flooding in winter, adversely affecting our infrastructure, roads, and access to the National Forest System lands. Climate change effects on fish. Lower summer stream flows and higher water temperatures are expected. Bull trout will be greatly affected by habitat loss, primarily because possibly higher peak flows and flooding in the winter will disrupt the reproductive cycle. And they're also a cold water species. Steelhead and red band trout and suckers will be less affected, but have lower populations because of habitat loss. And obviously continued competition from non-native fish species will be an additional stressor. So what I'm not going to do is try and address the nuance of climate change effects on each one of the plant communities in all of the elevational range that's represented in the scope landscape. I'm going to speak more to the disturbance effects that we can anticipate. So we expect wildfire will burn more area over a longer fire season. Bark beetles and other insects and pathogens will be more prevalent. Riparian and wetland species will be stressed, and the abundance and distribution of species will change over the long term. And again, that's quite variable depending on the plant community that you're speaking about. The wildfire area burned by 2050, go ahead and thumb down. In the Northwest, for a 2-degree Fahrenheit increase, the annual area burned will be at least 2 to 3 times higher than what it is currently. Climate change affects insects, and it particularly favors mountain pine beetle, increasing its reproductive rate and allowing for an expanded geographic range. Some general effects on wildlife: wetland-associated animals will likely decrease. Sagebrush-associated animals will likely decrease as well, probably because of more invasive species and more fire. Elk and deer may increase with more fire and habitat patches and mosaics on the landscape. And animals that live in old-growth forest could decrease with more high-severity catastrophic fire. Of course, all of this assumes that we haven't put any adaptation strategies into play. Climate change effects on summer recreation: higher temperatures and earlier snow melt will equate to a longer recreation season. We saw that a couple winters ago when we were all out hiking in January as opposed to skiing. That'll provide more opportunities for hiking, camping, biking, and OHV use during the shoulder seasons, and a greater demand for access at times when facilities are typically closed, or for that matter, we don't even have seasonal employees under the current climate in place. There aren't folks out there managing our facilities during the shoulder seasons. And potential impacts from higher use are myriad. And I would point to one that continues to come to my mind: when we have more folks out there on the landscape at periods of time when we typically haven't in the past, that could be very disruptive to wildlife species that are more sensitive to that kind of disruption. And so those are some of the potential impacts that we might be facing from higher extended use. Climate change effects on winter recreation: I think this goes without saying, but obviously lower amount and duration of snowpack will result in a shorter winter recreation season. Lower elevation trails and snow parks may be unsuitable for use. Meisner was interesting a couple of years ago. Skiers may need to travel farther for good snow. And Mount Bachelor may be okay for a while. Again, pointing just to the example that we had in the drier winters a couple of years ago, Mount Bachelor was one of the few resorts in the Cascade Range that was able to stay open. So climate change effects on ecosystem services. Without getting into each one of those ecosystem services, I do just want to speak to a couple of things housed in this chapter. So ecosystem services are broadly or simply defined as the benefits that nature provides to people. And again, we included this chapter to make sure that we could address resources that we felt were emerging, like pollinators, and management issues that aren't explicitly stated anywhere else. So this chapter includes forest products, it includes grazing management, geology and minerals, cultural resources, pollinators, carbon sequestration, and the impact of invasive species on our native systems. So I just want to touch briefly here on carbon, given obviously the significance of carbon in the climate conversation, to give you a sense of where we're headed nationally and what we're doing. So in 2015, the Forest Service created a set of preliminary carbon principles as outlined by the Washington office and the Climate Change Advisor's office to the Chief of the Forest Service. The carbon principles are fairly broad and general in nature. They speak to things like ensuring that we have resilient ecosystems and addressing that through structure and function. It also explicitly states that carbon should be treated as an ecosystem service in and of itself. And this is especially important because the forests of North America are considered to be a net carbon sink and really important for carbon storage into the future. So our management activities such as thinning and prescribed burning are recognized as resulting in a short-term carbon loss on the landscape, but those restoration activities are done deliberately to mitigate the effects of the widespread disturbances that I've mentioned to this point large-scale uncharacteristic wildfire, and insect and disease, and a larger extent of insect and disease outbreaks and infestation. Those disturbances also will act in concert with each other, and so our short-term forest restoration activities are intended to mitigate that and provide for carbon storage on the landscape over the long term. The Forest Service is also expected to consider carbon in the context of other ecosystem services. So it's not the sole focus, but it's one of many. And obviously we'll be looking at trade-offs at various timescales. Every forest in the nation has an estimated carbon estimate at this point. And something else I also wanted to mention is that harvested wood products such as lumber and other building materials, panels, those sorts of things, can account for significant off-site carbon storage, and we'll be tracking that into the future at a regional scale. Obviously, not knowing all the specifics around the effects of climate change on our vegetation communities, it's hard to say with certainty how carbon will be affected, but obviously it's a very important issue, and we'll continue to learn as everyone else learns around the effects of our management on carbon stores. So in summary, we have high certainty around the fact that there will be higher temperatures, more wildfire, less snowpack, less water in the summer months when demand is high, less fish habitat, and altered recreation patterns with an extension of recreation into more of the shoulder seasons. We have lower certainty around the distribution and abundance of vegetation and the effects of that on wildlife and wildlife habitat. Extreme events, drought, wildfire, insects, and disease will have the biggest effects and impacts on ecosystems, and things may change quickly after 2050. There are options for adapting to the effects of climate change, and there, of course, will be surprises. We don't know it all now. So revisiting this concept of adaptation strategy as an effort to reduce, to potentially reduce the negative consequences of climate change and to help ecosystems transition and natural resources transition to a warmer climate. I think there will be a lot of fine-tuning and prioritizing current planning and management based on adaptation strategies. And obviously it will be a fundamental component of sustainable resource management forever. It's also a form of risk management, as we have larger events such as flooding or landslides. We'll have to take into consideration adaptations to mitigate those for public safety and health. So moving into the last segment of the presentation, I want to share with you some more definitive examples of how adaptation strategies are being used on other forests in Region 6 that have been working at this for a while. The Olympic National Forest and the Olympic National Park were the first, to my knowledge, to complete a vulnerability assessment back in August of 2011. And this is what we're working towards. I didn't get to share that earlier. We're working towards a peer-reviewed general technical report. We just got in our draft vulnerability assessment. We're pushing 500 pages and we're missing a couple of chapters out of it still. So we're moving this direction, and we'll be, as the Olympic is, using that tool in concert with other tools such as vulnerability assessment specifically focused on trees in the Pacific Northwest or biodiversity in forests. So there's a lot of tools that we can lean on in addition to our own vulnerability assessment. Next slide. So the Olympic National Forest identified vulnerable resources similar to what we identified, and I just provide a few examples here. Looking at transportation and the vulnerabilities for transportation, obviously due to the high rainfall that they get. They are concerned about increased flows in water passage infrastructure, increased erosion and scour, and potential for cut bank failure on their transportation systems and bridges. In vegetation, they're looking at the potential for more high or large-scale mortality events and regeneration failure in reforestation efforts, and increased drought stress and decreased productivity of their forest systems. For wildlife, that connection then is limited connectivity of late successional forest and reduced habitat quality. So their adaptation strategies, next slide, that they have identified are to increase maintenance armoring and redundancy in their transportation system, decreasing reliance on drainage structures, and in some cases relocating and decommissioning road segments altogether where that makes sense. For vegetation, they're looking to develop and implement gene conservation plans. We're doing something similar here with whitebark pine. Increasing thinning and retaining minor species, perhaps those that are endemic or sensitive plants on the landscape. And for wildlife, they're looking to collaborate with neighbors on treatment areas, and that just speaks to the social aspect of adaptation strategy development and how we need to work with partners now and into the future. And obviously increasing density of legacy structures in some of their younger forests near old forests to improve habitat connectivity over their landscape. So they've gone as far as to take it a next step to an action plan, which is the implementation plan from the vulnerability assessment. And they're using that as their monitoring tool to track changes in plant communities over time. That's obviously put into place to increase biodiversity and increase resiliency and help them prepare for the future and inform management decisions. The Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, next slide, is taking a similar approach, and I can see how we would do something similar here. They're trying to bundle their efforts and adaptation strategies to improve watershed function. So they're doing similar things to what I mentioned for the Olympic: road decommissioning, road closing, road upgrading, recognizing that roads themselves are hydrologic connectors on our landscape. They're also doing commercial thinning to accelerate their plantations toward a more wildfire-resistant condition. Next slide. A conversation that we're having region-wide in Region 6, which I think is really important, is one about reforestation. For years and years, we would reforest with certain species, and we would now we need to look at areas where the forest automatically replanted things like ponderosa pine and see if that's still even a viable option, if it's still going to support overstory trees. And the last example I'll provide is the Mount Baker Snoqualmie. They're using their vulnerability assessment to inform proposed actions in NEPA and project level planning. They're also highlighting the need for improving resiliency, citing their document, and they're using this to support funding proposals for adaptation work, which is always really critical. And it'll be useful in revision of their land and resource management plan as well. So obviously these vulnerability assessments are big. They're not a sit-down cover-to-cover read, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to communicate what we're doing and make that user-friendly, not only for our publics, but for our technical staffs and for our specialists and decision makers. So we plan to build fact sheets that touch on each one of these key resources that I've mentioned, and that'll speak in a more limited way to the potential climate change impacts and adaptation strategies for those specific resources. And so what I'll leave you with is I think that continuing to work together on this is really critically important. Partnership and community are the best way forward, in my view. As I mentioned, our vulnerability assessment and all of the outcomes from it will be more available to us in, I hope, March of 2017, perhaps April at the latest. And we look forward to sharing those results, and I'd be happy to collect contact information from folks today. If you'd like to stay in touch on where we're at with this, I'm sure we'll have lots of rollout sessions as it relates to this information, particularly because we'll be leading up to revision of our land and resource management plan about a year from now. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes, in the middle.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I was intrigued by what you were saying. My background is 30 years teaching ecology, university level, and it was that got me really energized about the whole area of climate change, realizing how the business as usual scenarios were going to influence temperature and water availability. And I've been looking at some of the impacts. You may be familiar with Rayfeld climate envelope studies, which suggest, for example, that Oregon will be outside the range of the lodgepole pine by the end of the century. My question is, if we actually follow that business as usual scenario, is it reasonable to expect there is going to be a forest anywhere in Oregon?
So business as usual, I think it would help me to have you define business as usual.
That's the scenario that assumes we continue to emit greenhouse gases at an accelerating rate as we have been doing. In the latest IPCC, it's represented by the representative concentration pathway 8.6.
Okay, so I wasn't sure if you were referring to greenhouse gas emissions or
Sorry, yes.
practices of the Forest Service, so I thought I better check in. It's a fair question. So I think that particularly in Central Oregon, we're very invested in increasing forest resiliency. And we do that in concert with our partners and our collaborators. I think we have to be, to some degree, really vigilant about the pace and scale in which we're able to accomplish that work. And I think if we are able to do that in really key locations, I think about refugia, like North Slopes, those places on the landscapes that we're going to really be focused on, old growth forest structure. I think to some degree we can mitigate the effects of climate change and approximate a more of a historic range of variability that will set us up to be more responsive and lessen the impacts of climate change and these large-scale disturbances that we're talking about for the future. So I'd like to believe, yes, that we'll have forested ecosystems. I can't predict that myself, but I think that that's the focus of the Forest Service, and that's appropriate, and it fits within the context of what we know about climate change effects now. Yes.
Toward the end of your presentation, you gave a couple examples of how other forests are using their vulnerability assessments.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to vary quite a bit. Do you have a sense of where scope's going to go with your vulnerability? I mean, which direction are you going to go with it? Are you going to be more prescriptive? Are you going to be more general and broad and include it in forest management planning, or
Sure.
what?
So ours are pretty broad statements so far on adaptations, and it's expected to be a higher level document. That's on purpose. I think when you get into the climate change action plan, like the example that the Olympic is using currently, that's when you get a little bit more prescriptive. And I also think that these are living documents. As we learn more, that information might grow and change over time to fit what we know better into the future. And so ours right now, the adaptations, the vulnerability assessments are very detailed. The adaptation strategies are fairly broad in nature, and I think that's purposeful because we're still exploring adaptation strategies.
My question goes back to how you opened the presentation, mentioning how important it will be for the city of Bend, now that it's passed its climate ordinance, to take into account in its coming activities related to inventory and action planning for their climate ordinance, to work to include the national forest. And I'm supposing you mean the Deschutes National Forest in that process. So what would you see as the best way of that happening? And could you talk a little bit more about that?
About how to work together with the city?
How would you see that? What's the best way that could happen, and what aspects of the vulnerability assessment do you see pieces of it being more relevant than others, or what's your vision there?
Well, I certainly think that probably the next best avenue will be as we launch into the revision of our land and resource management plan, because we'll be actively seeking input and partners to work with on that, and it's great timing for what the City of Bend is doing. And so I would say that's probably the next most concrete step that we could take. I also think there's a lot of opportunity informally to be working together. We do have specialists in the Bend office that are part of the state and private forestry arm of the Forest Service, and they can help with some of the futuring that the City of Bend is doing. I think any of our specialists could do that as well. We have the Wildland Urban Interface, And the urban growth boundary, I think there's a lot of conversation around that as it relates to expectations for the effects of climate change on that boundary and that interface. I actually think the door is sort of wide open to continue working together, and actually I don't think we can't afford not to work together. And so I don't know that I can think of sort of definitive points in time, like in the next couple of months. But I do feel like that's going to be critical. And the same thing's going to be true for the Prineville community, the city of Redmond, all of our communities that are represented in the scope landscape. City of Bend's going to be critical, obviously, for the Deschutes National Forest, but that includes Sisters, it includes Crescent. So all of those communities need to be engaged in the conversation. And I think the effort needs to be coordinated. Yeah.
Kind of a comment to the first question and then a question of my own. I think as far as risk of losing forests, I think looking beyond just national forests, but I think North American forests, there is some discussion about triage, that there are places like maybe the southwestern U.S. where forests as we know them may not persist under some of these scenarios, and there's other places that may be largely unaffected, but I think Central Oregon's a great example where we're kind of in that middle ground where in a triage scenario it's the place to apply the first aid because you have a chance to adapt and to make it more resilient. My question kind of gets, and you didn't really touch on it in your presentation, is kind of policy adaptation. As we all know, the Forest Service has layers and layers of policies that you're trying to navigate through. And a big one is the Endangered Species Act, and we've all seen how the spotted owl has kind of limited your management in a lot of ways once the ESA kicks in. It seems like with the picture you're painting, you can almost predict a kind of a cascading scenario of plant and animal species one by one hitting the wall and triggering the Endangered Species Act, where almost that becomes your whole business by 2100. Any comment on that? Because I'm not sure if your adaptation strategies are going to prevent certain species hitting the trigger for Endangered Species Act protection.
And I don't know that they will. I would think that, the other aspect of this is sort of this all lands approach, right? And so that's a key focus for us right now. And obviously we're significant players in species habitat, but I think that the all lands approach is an important consideration for that. And so not knowing how, and depending on the species that you're talking about, if it's a migratory species, for example, there's such a geographic extent that could be a part of whether or not a species is successful or continues to struggle. I think there's a lot that we need to work through there. But I guess I do worry about that from a land management perspective, that we'll have additional species listings. And of course, there's an emphasis on listed species for very good reason. And I don't really know how to forecast what that will be like, but I do have that same sense that you do to some degree, that we'll be seeing more listings and it'll be more difficult to manage. And certainly we have to look even at the capacity of our partners in this, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's a whole bunch of resources that would need to be put into motion, I think, to account for what we're anticipating.
Well, just to follow up, I think in the past we've been focusing a lot on wildlife, but I could see plants becoming a big issue where you have plants with a very limited range and they're not able to adapt. And so all of a sudden your management and that range is going to be significantly limited as you're trying to save that.
Right. And I do think some of the adaptation strategies that we're looking at, which is why we include invasive species, that's redundant throughout the document, is looking at the impacts of invasive species on potential even type conversions. Coming from the Southwest region, I can tell you, we watched red brome very closely and bufflegrass very closely in type conversions of the Sonoran Desert systems. And so, there are those potentials here for those lower elevation plant communities. I wholeheartedly agree that we'll see more plant species potentially be listed as sensitive or threatened, and especially those ones that are endemic here will be a big concern, like Pumice grapefruit. So, I agree.
Time is expiring. We have some things that we need to to do, and so unfortunately, you're going to be available. Would you be around to
I will, I'd be happy to answer questions
additional
later on. Yep.
questions?
Yeah, thank you so
Okay.
much.
I think we should thank Kristin for coming. And I'm going to take a risk and do something inappropriate real fast, and that is, and something as federal employees not allowed to talk a lot about, but all these things are when I looked at what Kristin presented, I see dollar signs flying all over the place. And there's two solutions to that. One, partnerships and working together for efficiency, and the other thing is, you're not allowed to lobby for dollars, so I will. And I say the Forest Service needs our support to have the funds to maintain the forest so we can enjoy it.